Hello, everybody. Welcome to Slam, the podcast that reviews every single DC superhero in history. I am your host, Mike L. And unfortunately, our regular cast is not with us tonight, but we are joined by two very special guests. First, returning guest, Brad Fay. Thank you for joining us, Brad.
Oh, thank you again for having me.
Absolutely. And for the first time ever, my Facebook friend, who I've never actually met before today, Paul, I'm going to, hopefully I pronounce this right, Paul Carbonaro, is that right?
Almost. Carbonaro.
Carbonaro.
Yes.
All right, there you go. Okay, so this is an international podcast now because we have myself from Canada, Brad's from the US, and Paul, you're originally from the UK, but now you're in the US, right?
That's right.
Excellent. Okay, so why don't we, before we jump into reviewing these comics, Paul, let's talk about The Flash. I actually gave you an option of what episode you wanted to be on for Slam, and you picked The Flash. Is there a reason for that?
Because when I was like 4 years old and started to learn to read, I read the Superman titles, Superman family titles, Batman, Green Lantern, Flash, and even at that young age, I loved the name The Flash, and I loved the design of the costume, which I believe is Carmine Infantino's. And so even as a little kid, I would see that on the rack and I'd get excited. And I'm sure The Flash helped me learn to read.
Well, you mentioned the costume. I think it's important to note that this costume, there's two important things about it. It's influenced by Captain Marvel, right? The original, the Shazam Captain Marvel, with the red and the yellow design with the lightning bolt. But the other thing is I think this is the first superhero costume that, rather than being a belt with underwear and gloves, it's just it's a one piece, right? Which then influenced Green Lantern, the Atom, Spider-Man, and then all the other superheroes that came after it, right? So I think that's really significant, Carmine Infantino's design. Yeah. Really cool design, especially, I mean, you just have to compare it to the Jay Garrick design and see the difference, right? But yes. So Brad, you're also a fan of The Flash, right? How long have you been Flash?
I was a big fan of, the Flash TV series, and that kind of brought me, so a little bit newer to, I always was a big Green Lantern fan, big, Justice League. I love Flash in the cartoons. Like, sure. Obviously he was, the funny guy. So who doesn't like the funny guy on the team? So I always a fan from a distance, but this was like my up close, and personal kind of get throwing into really learning. And I've got to be honest, I'm more confused about The Flash than ever. Definitely a lot going on.
Hey, well, hopefully we learned something on this podcast. That's part of the reason we do it, right? I grew up being obsessed with this minutiae, right, of Earth 1 and Earth 2, and which we'll probably talk about in later episodes of the show. But the idea does come from The Flash, but these issues that we're talking about today just introduce the character, and we're kind of comparing the origins and the powers and stuff like that. So first we're going to start off with the introduction of the Jay Garrick Flash from Flash Comics #1. And Paul, you're going to very quickly summarize the story from memory, so it might be a little bit hazy on the details, but we'll help you out if we can. So feel free, jump in and tell us what happened in this first Flash story.
I think it's pretty easy to say it briefly because not a whole lot happened. And what did happen wasn't that interesting, but I'm being unkind because after all, it was an origin story from the golden age. So basically we've got Jay Garrick. He has the potential to be successful, but he's a bit of a loser. He's a bit of a loser because he hasn't succeeded in this and hasn't succeeded in that. And we know he is because his the one he wants to be his girlfriend, refuses because he doesn't make good enough effort on the football team. Mm-hmm. He's a scrub, apparently, on the football team. And to rub salt into the wound, she's going on a date with the football team captain. So it reminded me
Classic.
of the beach scene where the skinny guy gets the sand kicked in his face.
Right.
And the girlfriend with him at the beach says, "Don't worry about it, little man." and he goes away and beefs up. Anyway, but the actual story is that he has an accident with chemicals, because who doesn't? And it involves hard water. There's a lot of emphasis on hard water in this Golden Age origin story. It's made me very skeptical about hard water. I will now think about it in ways I never thought about it before. I will be wary of hard water. So between hard water and the clumsy Jay Garrick knocking something over in a laboratory, the chemicals spill, the smoke fills the room, and he suddenly has lightning speed. And so, of course, he's going to use it to good effect. And that includes becoming an instant star on the football team, because he can run faster than everybody else, and that helps him to get the girlfriend. But besides that, there are some petty criminals here and there, and he goes around rounding people up or just helping out. And in this issue, there's a group called the Faultless Four.
Right.
And I'm not really sure in what way they're faultless. They seem very fallible to me. And the new Flash, this newly created Flash, Jay Garrick, certainly shows them that they have flaws. They are not faultless, and he overcomes them pretty much with ease. And the only other thing I think to say about this origin story is the costume is kind of in keeping with Golden Age costumes. It's not the kind of costume we would accept in Silver Age or Bronze Age, because I know they're giving a nod to mythology, but running around with a metal helmet and a couple of wings seems a bit odd. But then again, Thor had a metal helmet, so
that's a good point.
Maybe I'm being too harsh. And that's it. For me, that's it.
So let's just say, so for those that don't know, the original Flash's costume, red shirt, yellow lightning bolt, blue pants. In this appearance, he has yellow lightning streaks down the side, which he loses later. He has red boots with wings on them. And like you said, the key thing that separates him from other superheroes is he has the pan helmet like Mercury, the god, with little wings on it. And no mask, right? So he's not really hiding his identity. So I don't think I've ever read this before. It was entertaining. I would say the origin is almost like Superhero Origins 101. A random accident happens. He gets powers. He uses them in a slightly selfish way, but then learns to use them to fight crime. He's got the girlfriend, right? Being treated with a little bit of disrespect by the girl, who prefers the jock or whatever on the in the story, is kind of like something that was a little bit used in Superman, later used in Spider-Man. So I like that part of it, but especially compared to what comes after it, we can contrast this and see the writing was not as sophisticated and the art was not the greatest in the story. It was rudimentary. It was straightforward, but it wasn't great. But I think this is the first time I've ever read this, and I can't imagine reading myself any more Jay Garrick Flash stories. But Brad, what was your first impression of this story?
Yeah, one of the things I found most interesting, I'm very much into kind of like, not so much debunking pop culture myths as much as, we grow up and, we're always told this story and we just kind of like come to accept it as fact. And the thing I found most interesting, I had never read this story either. And, I always grew up with, Peter Parker, what made him successful is he's a nerdy guy who suddenly gets powers. He wants to use them selfishly at first. So I'm always like, okay, that's kind of what set that new model. But like reading this, I saw like a lot of parallels. I'm like,
right.
I would assume if Jay's playing like college sports, he's probably also a teenager or pretty close to it. He also at first, rather than go into wrestling, he's using his abilities for football before learning. So I'm like, this really isn't that far off of being a template for what would kind of become Peter Parker. So that
Absolutely.
was stood out to me.
That's the thing. You're right. I always thought that the X-Men were a team of superhero or of teenage superheroes, but Peter Parker was the first non-sidekick teenage superhero. And maybe he is, but the Flash, like you said, if he's not a teenager, he's close to it because he's graduating from university. And that's definitely younger, as far as I know, than any of the other DC superheroes that were introduced at this time. So you're right. It's very close to Spider-Man. The way that he uses his powers at first is close to Spider-Man. One thing he did different from other superheroes is right before gaining his powers, he feels it's time. He has enough time to have a smoke. Boy, feels good. Football training or no oop. So technically, the reason he gains superpowers is because while he's having a cigarette break, he knocks over a bunch of chemicals, which they don't usually talk about that when they reiterate his origin. So Paul, were you surprised by that?
But then you have to think about the time.
Sure. Right.
So I guess, even when I was a kid, everybody was smoking. Not kids, like adults. So.
Well, there are comics where Bruce Wayne was smoking in the 30s and 40s, and even into the 80s. There's a Teen Titans comic where Bruce Wayne is smoking a pipe. I always thought that was funny,
Yeah.
But definitely not what I'd expect from a superhero, but it kind of just makes, it gives you a giggle. But Paul, what did you think of the art in this one?
I think the word you said, rudimentary.
Right.
The professionals at the time, they didn't have any illusions they were doing anything other than kind of churning stuff out for kids, and therefore everything is drawn, in a very rudimentary way. A slight aside is that on my one visit to the Marvel offices in the 1980s, I was in the office of one of the editors there, and John Bogdanoff, whose birthday is today also, was visiting. And he told John Bogdanoff, draw so a blind man can read it. And I think that's what they did in the Golden Age. They just drew very, very rudimentary stuff. There was no hint of a Neil Adams.
No. Like that. You know what? I have to agree. I mean, the Golden Age, I have a great affection for the Silver Age. Golden Age is usually stuff that I have a hard time getting into, no matter what. There's a few exceptions. There's a few standard artists, but for the most part, it's very lackluster, to say the least. So, yeah, I didn't love this art. Brad, were you a fan of the art at all?
I'll be more complimentary in just a sense of I think for its time, it stood out aside from some of the other stuff I've seen from Golden Age, but definitely not revolutionary by any means. It almost kind of like thumbnail. It was almost treated like thumbnails. Kind of like when you're looking at, like film negatives. And you're kind of looking at all these really small, that's what a lot of Golden Age kind of when I go back and try to read the Golden Age Batman and Superman, that's what I'm kind of reminded of, these little, panels that you got to really squint to see.
Right. Well, here's the thing is I think for the most part, almost all of these DC superheroes were rebooted in the 50s and 60s, and most of them were vastly improved, which we're going to see in our next review. But I think there's definitely a reason why this origin was rebooted and this costume was rebooted and the powers rebooted, even the source of his power. The fact that it was just spilled hard water is just not as cool as what we're going to see in Barry Allen's origin, which we're going to jump to right now, showcase number 4, which is the beginning of the Silver Age of comics. And I can't remember who we agreed. Who's going to summarize this one?
I think I could take Barry.
Okay, there you go. So Barry Allen's first appearance, the beginning of the Silver Age. Tell us, Brad, what happens in this one.
Yeah, so Barry Allen, I want to say this is 1956 in Showcase Comics number 4, the introduction to Barry Allen. And this is, of course, after one of the most underrated comic creators to me is Julie Schwartz. I think when a lot of people talk about the Mount Rushmore, there's a lot of names that jump out, but I think, the impact he kind of had, and you mentioned kind of, revitalizing a lot of these comics and giving them, he had a sci-fi background, and you kind of see that a little bit with Green Lantern, Flash. So in this version of the Flash, Barry Allen is, and this I didn't know at all, Barry Allen is reading comic books that feature Jay Garrick, which is kind of a jump in terms of so this is a fictional character or were the comics based on the real life Flash? But whatever that ends up being, Barry Allen then ends up gaining superpowers. His are more like lightning, kind of like a little bit of a Frankenstein vibe going on. I think he's flashed by lightning around a bunch of chemicals. So it's a little bit more sci-fi infused than the hard water. Also gains super speed. One of the standouts to me, he goes on to fight the Turtle Man, is the villain of this book. So you get kind of that dichotomy of, the fastest hero versus the slowest villain. So you kind of get that element going on, which is kind of a staple now in a lot of, or becomes a staple in a lot of sci-fi or Silver Age type comics. But what jumped out to me too is, we talked about Spider-Man, influences for Spider-Man. There's a sequence where, I don't remember if it's Iris, but is a server in a diner and she trips and spills her tray, and Barry Allen proceeds to grab everything and replace it back on the tray, which took me back to the original Spider-Man movie. So definitely, again, it's subtle, but there's a lot of, things that I see influencing what would become Spider-Man's world, whether it be in the comic books or the Tobey Maguire films decades later. You could tell a lot of creators of Spider-Man were Barry Allen fans at some point.
Well, and the thing is this story has as many absurd moments as the Jay Garrick story, but there's something about it that I just find so much more enjoyable. Like I was first exposed to the Flash comics when I was a kid. I had a treasury-sized edition of the Superman's Race with the Flash that collected, I believe, 2 or 3 of the stories from the 60s, and one of them was written by Jim Shooter, and I thought it was brilliant. Okay, and the art, I don't remember if it was Kurt Swan that did the art, but that's what made me love Silver Age DC and Silver Age Superman and Silver Age Flash. And I've read this story a few times, and obviously, like you said, there's him reading the comics is kind of ridiculous. A lot of the elements of the story are ridiculous, but I think the art by Carmine Infantino is very creative. The sequence with him, again, going into almost bullet time, which is what we call it now, and then catching all of the items on the tray. It's clever. There's more creativity. There's more thought and more like of a science fiction bend put into this. Also, when he sees the bullet flying towards Iris, and you can see the look on his face change as he's watching it. Things like that I think are great. So I really enjoyed the story, and I can see exactly why this really ignited a revival in interest in superheroes and led to the Silver Age of superheroes, which then brought in the Marvel Age of superheroes. So I really like this. Paul, what was your thoughts on this story?
The same as yours. I thought it was a much better crafted, and you can just see. I mean, you can just see it. It's right there. So much better written, so much better drawn, so much more thought put into it. But actually, I liked the touch of Barry Allen reading the original Golden Age Flash. I thought that was a nice touch, because in that one instance, he reduced the Golden Age Flash to a comic book character. And by definition, made him real. Right? Because
that's a good point.
Now he's real. I thought that was a nice touch. And I agree with you 100%. You can see why that issue, Showcase number 4, ignited the Silver Age.
Well, and it's funny, I didn't even realize this, but the inks in this issue were by Joe Kubert, who I think is a great comic book artist. And Carmine Infantino's later style gets very angular and kind of simplified, but you can see how Joe Kubert smooths it out a little bit. There's some really good shots where the inks are just brilliant, like the on page 12 of this first story, when Flash is just a side shot of the Flash. It's a nice profile shot, and is almost like the sun behind him. And just the detail in the background is just such a nice way to make his face pop out. The expression on his face is nice. When the Flash is in the tunnel in the sewer, the texture on the water is great. The shadows on the pipes are great. When he's in the boat and we see the attention to detail and the waves of the water, I just think it's great. Also, I love in these Silver Age stories when they use pseudoscience to defeat the villains. This isn't a typical, like a Marvel superhero story where they kind of just punch each other out. The fact that the Flash is essentially being outsmarted because his own power is making the turtle, like the wake of his running is making the turtle always be ahead of him. So then he has to change his plan, and he's got to run around the turtle to defeat him. It's a very simple concept, and obviously it's aimed at kids, but I still appreciate that little bit of thought that's put into it, right, to resolve the story. So I thought that was great. And we have the girlfriend, which he goes on to marry in the later stories. She's been a character in every, I think, adaptation of The Flash since then. I don't know what else to say about this. I really enjoyed it. And again, because before we started rolling, Paul and I were talking about rereading our old comics and how some of them don't hold up. We're almost scared to reread them. I find that no matter how many times I go back to these Silver Age comics, even though I'm reading it with a grain of salt, knowing it's more for kids, I still tend to enjoy them. I don't know if you guys have any comments about that. Brad, do you feel that way, or?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, it really is impressive to me that, like, you know, as comic book fans, you know, I don't know how much this holds true for everyone else. Like, I could look at a book and know what decade it is. You know, I could look. You know, we talked about the, you know, Golden Age Batman, Superman. I know when I look at it, okay, this is like a 1940s. I know, you know, 1980s. Like, okay, and maybe that's just because we know the artist. I don't know what it is, but the Barry Allen Flash we were talking about, I'm shocked that that's from the 50s. I mean, this isn't a year or two before Fantastic Four gets launched. This is like 5 years. This is, you know, half a decade, and I really think it holds up just as much as a lot of the, you know, the Silver Age comic books, you know, come like Jack Kirby in the 60s and some of Steve Ditko's work. Like, this to me just falls right in. There's not like that moment of awkward, like, wait, no, this is from a different era. It really holds up against that stuff.
Right. I think it's kind of like, for example, I'm a big fan of, say, Looney Tunes. And everyone knows there's those weird early Looney Tunes when they were drawn a little different, right? And the writing wasn't quite as sharp. And you can watch them, you can enjoy them. But then when you hit that sweet spot of Looney Tunes, when the art got better and the timing got better and the jokes still hit now, you know, 70 years later, they're just as funny. And that's what I feel like the Silver Age is for DC. There's that period of 10 or 15 years where the art was great, the writing was great, the characters, everything clicked for me. And so that's why I am a big fan of the Silver Age. And Paul, I assume you're a fan of the Silver Age as well, right?
Yes, but like we said, I'm afraid sometimes.
You're afraid. Yeah, I gotcha. But so far in your memory, you have fond memories of the Silver Age, of reading Silver Age comics.
Yeah, but you see, I read DC, Flash, Green Lantern, Superman, all those from about the ages of 4 to 6.
Gotcha.
And I read Harvey comics as well, let's say even up to 7 years old. But then where I was living in London, we had black and white reprints of Marvel comics for the first time in weekly magazines called Fantastic and Terrific. And I always remember, as soon as I read that first story in Fantastic #1, which was X-Men #1, I forgot all about DC completely.
Gotcha.
It was just especially X-Men and Thor and Doctor Strange, especially those three, supported by Avengers and Iron Man. I didn't enjoy Submariner. Those were the 6 strips. So I think Silver Age comics hold up a little bit better than many Bronze Age ones.
Sure.
Because Silver Age were well crafted. Bronze Age was a little bit more kind of flying by the seat of your pants kind of thing sometimes. And so there's some great Bronze Age stuff, but at the same time, it's a bit more ambitious than Silver Age stuff, so it doesn't always hold up so well. I think that sounds like a topic for like a whole book or something. But to answer your question, yeah, I appreciate Silver Age, and I really do think that Flash in Showcase #4, that was like a 1960s comic book, like you said, Brad, in 1956. I think is more sophisticated than Fantastic Four #1.
Yeah.
Yep, I agree. And that's the thing is I have nothing bad to say about 60s Marvel because I love it. But there was definitely an early period, like, for example, on Fantastic Four. To me, Fantastic Four took at least 30 issues to hit its stride. And then from around issue 30 to about maybe 60, 70, it was at its peak. And then after that, it wasn't quite as good, but it was still good. But like early Avengers was kind of rough, right? Until maybe Don Heck. When Don Heck started, I loved Don Heck. And I love John Buscema's art. I love it. With X-Men, it was different because Kirby only did the first year. And then it got rough after that, in my opinion. Right?
I think his influence was all the way through 18.
Okay.
And it was bi-monthly, of course, until a certain point. So maybe that's the first 2 years. See,
Sure.
because if you see something like the Sentinels three-parter, and I know we're here to talk about the Flash, not the X-Men, but if you see the Sentinels three-parter, that's got Jack Kirby all over it. Who else but Jack Kirby would have created the Sentinels and designed them as he did? You know?
Yo, you don't have to tell me. I love Kirby. We'll definitely once we do our '60s Marvel episode, we will.
Yeah.
We'd love to have you back on.
I definitely wanted to pick Paul's brain about that too. I don't want to go too far up, but when he said he liked the X-Men from the jump, I was really interested in that because again, the story we've always been told is the X-Men books weren't that popular. It wasn't until they were canceled and then revived. So it's interesting to talk to someone who's like, no, I was in right from the start.
Right, and obviously, yeah. Go ahead, Paul.
It really is nonsense when people talk about how it was like some failure or something. It wasn't. With Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, it was very, very good. And only once, they both left, and then Roy Thomas took over. And I'm sure, not that I was there, but Stan Lee told him, okay, make it more conventional. Then it started to go downhill. And it had some highlights, but it just trended down. So yes, between about issue 20 and 56, which is a long stretch, there are some highlights, but the trend isn't good. But those first 19 issues, I think, are wonderful. I don't care that Alex Todd over Jack Kirby layouts wasn't an ideal recipe. That was still wonderful. When I was a kid reading these things, issue after issue after issue, story after story, just blew me away. They really did. Just the excitement of it. You can tell just by the way I'm talking, from the Savage Land, Stranger, and the two-part Juggernaut, three-part Sentinels, and then the two-part shocking return of Magneto and the introduction of the Mimics. Like, what more do you want?
I can't argue with that. I mean, I have read the first year or two of X-Men, but I definitely plan to reread them. And now you've got me, even more excited. I think you're in the same boat as me, Brad. Yeah, it's got me thinking about the X-Men. But we still have one more Flash comic to review. We're going to jump ahead now to, without getting into a long history lesson, at this point, the Barry Allen Flash had been killed in the Crisis on Infinite Earths, which is we can't even, if you don't know what it is, we don't have time to talk about it, but it changed everything. They killed off Supergirl. They killed off the Flash. And now in this story, Wally West, who is formerly the Kid Flash, the partner of Barry Allen, he becomes the Flash. And I have read, I think every Mark Waid Flash. I'd read the Grant Morrison run. I'd read some of the Jeff Johns run. This is the first time I'd ever read this story, and I was pleasantly surprised. Now, the reason that I hadn't read it is because I was is the word trepidatious? Is that a word?
Yeah.
I think. Is it? Probably not. But anyway, I have mixed feelings about Mike Baron. I'd read his Nexus, and I liked the art on Nexus, but never the writing. About a year ago, I read Mike Baron's Punisher #1 for the first time, and I actually really enjoyed it. And so that's what this reminded me of. And I kind of forgot that he did it. But as I was reading it, I was like, this narration feels like more like film noir to me, right? Which reminded me of the Punisher. So, of course, it's the same writer. But anyway, just to summarize this quickly, the story jumps in first with telling us right from the get-go about how they don't come out and say that his powers have changed, but there's definitely a different way that they're treating his powers. He's much slower than the Barry Allen Flash. He needs to consume calories at a higher rate to replenish himself, right? We see a quick scene of him meeting up with the Teen Titans, which he's still in the Teen Titans at this point. And then right away, he's kind of given a mission. Someone requests that he transport a frozen heart across the country to give to someone as an organ transplant. And we get an interesting scene where he says, well, the question is, what can you do for me? And they're kind of, and the narration, like they look at me like I spit on the carpet or something the minute yawns. Basically, at this point, it was always understood that superheroes did things out of the goodness of their heart, not for payment. But in this story, we're introduced to this idea that Wally West is actually looking for something. Here he asked for health insurance, right? So again, we're kind of like in a little bit of post-Watchmen elevated bit of realism with the story, right? Which makes it feel a little bit more modern. So he's basically running across the country, and we're getting this kind of cool narration. He's narrating what it actually feels like as he's running across all these different kinds of terrains. There's an interesting scene where he comes across one man, looks like he's choking another man. He doesn't really have time to stop, so he keeps running. But then he goes back and he sees that the one guy has disappeared and there's just the other guy that's left. And he gets a hint of who the guy is. The guy tells him it's Vandal Savage, who the readers would know, but maybe, I don't know if Wally West knows who Vandal Savage is. I don't know if they would point that out or not. Oh yeah, he's like, who? So he doesn't know who he is.
Yeah.
So he runs away. So he keeps going. He makes his way to the other side of the country. And he ends up successfully delivering the heart. And then I'm just kind of skimming through this as we're going. And then this sounds really boring to the listeners. I keep saying, and then but that's really what's happening here. Oh yeah. So then he eats, right? Because he's got to replenish his calories. He has to take the plane back. While he's on the plane, someone tries to hijack the plane. He very quickly intervenes. Defeats this bad guy. But the thing is in this story, he doesn't really make an effort to hide his identity, but he also doesn't advertise it. So it's kind of, again, a slight change from Barry Allen or the standard superhero who is always, so protective about the secret identity. But I love this ending because then he comes home, walks into his apartment, and who's standing there? First he sees almost like a wrapped gift box on his table. He opens it up and there's a heart inside. And then he turns around and who's standing there but Vandal Savage. So it's a nice little story with a nice little cliffhanger ending that made me want to go on and read the very next one, which of course I did, and it was just as good. So I was really impressed with this issue. Paul, what did you think about it?
Well, in general, I jumped on all the DC number ones.
Okay.
Because I'm one person who actually appreciated Crisis and the consequence of Crisis. I know DC fans are still very angry about that. They liked all their multiple Earths and everything else, but I was a simple-minded Marvel reader, and I just wanted one universe, and so they gave it to me. And so I eagerly bought issue 1. I enjoyed it in the same way that you described, which doesn't surprise me since most of the time I think our opinions match.
That's right. That's why you're on this podcast. Go ahead.
And, I don't think there's more I can say about it that you haven't already said. It was good enough to get me also to think, okay, let me keep going with this. And I did for about nine or 10 issues. But I'm sorry to say that in comparison to the Mark Waid issues, there's no comparison. Because Mark Waid was born to write The Flash. Mark Waid is the Flash writer. So I liked Mike Barron's Flash #1 and Jackson Guice, of course, the artist. It was definitely good enough. But for me, in my heart, no, it's Mark Waid and not even Grant Morrison, who I really appreciate. No, nobody touches Mark Waid.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Brad. What were your thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, I think you guys covered it. The one thing that stood out to me, like of all the Flashes, Wally West is definitely the one I have the least, had the least familiarity with coming in. Didn't really know much about him. The one thing that surprised me is I was a big fan. Brad Meltzer is one of my favorite comic book writers. And he did a lot of work. And I remember when he rebooted the Justice League, I want to say this Flash, was asked to join, and it was like such a big honor for him. I want to say they were kind of going towards like the younger superheroes with that team. There were some of the, the old favorites, but I think it was like, what was like Green Arrow's sidekick, Speedy, I think.
Speedy or Arsenal at the time, yeah.
Yeah, so he's in it. But what stood out to me is how long, this comic came out in the 80s, so I'm like, it was 30 years in like real time. I forget when the Brad Meltzer arc was, but I'm like, man, that kind of makes it even like cooler that was this big deal. But me reading that without having known how long this character had been around, I'm like, oh, okay, they're kind of handing the baton to the younger superheroes. I'm like, they actually did put in their work and put in their dues.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I try not to analyze comic book time too much, but I know what you're saying. Like, sometimes they'll write these characters as, oh, they're hitting the 30th birthday, and then like the next writer will treat them like they're in college or they're teenagers, right? Like, so I try not to even worry about that.
Sure, yeah. I
Yeah.
guess I mean it more of like the payoff for the fans, I mean.
Sure.
Not for the actual, like, but for a fan being like, wow, I followed this Flash for that long, and now he's finally a member of the Justice League. I was like, okay, this must be a much cooler moment for a long time fan versus like me, who's like, oh, okay, he's Kid Flash is now Flash.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so you hadn't read this before. I think the thing that stood out to me is it did feel very modern, and I have read a lot of 80s DC in the last few years, and there was this feeling of, rejuvenation after Crisis, right? But a lot of them didn't hold up as well as I thought they would, but I did like this issue. Again, because this is late 80s, there's a little bit more realism in ingested. No, what's the word I'm looking for? Not ingested. Injected into it. And I'm really torn because, like I said, I grew up on the Silver Age Flash, stopping bullets after he hears the gun go off, which is impossible because the speed of sound, right? Like, it's impossible to react in that amount of time. But anyway, that being said, I still love those Silver Age stories with their pseudoscience. But if you're going to try to do stories that are for a little bit more of an older audience, you kind of have to have a little bit of realism in there. And I like the fact that they introduced this idea that he's got to replenish his calories. I like him narrating the story as he's running through the countryside and running at the speed of light. To me, it's so ridiculous to have a character like even Quicksilver in the X-Men movies. Once you have a character that can react that quickly, what good is anyone else really good for, right? So I like the fact that I think in the story they might have said he's limited to the speed of sound or something, which I think is not realistic, but more realistic, more acceptable, more down to earth, right? So I'm definitely going to go ahead. I think Mike Baron only did maybe 18 issues or something like that, 12 or 18. I'm going to read those all. And I'm looking forward to William Esner Loeb's run. I don't know how great it is, but I've liked his Superman run, and I think it was Action Comics, so I'm going to read that. But I agree with you, Paul. Mark Waid's Flash, I'm a huge fan of Mark Waid, almost everything he does, but you're right. To me, Wally West is like his alter ego. He was definitely born to write that character. And I'm always on the fence about whether they should have brought back Barry Allen or not. But if Mark Waid thinks they should have kept Barry Allen dead, then I can't disagree because I don't know more than Mark Waid. That's how I'm going to leave it, right? But I'm definitely going to read more of these. So I guess here's the question, Paul. We've talked about rereading old comics. Are you going to go back and reread this run, or are you just going to leave it in your memories?
Unfortunately, I'm too busy with laundry and cooking and other stuff.
I hear you.
No, but I'm being a little facetious. I would happily reread that run, but I'd be looking forward more to when I got up to the Mark Waid era.
Okay, and so Brad, you haven't read any of this first 80s run of this Flash. You haven't read it all, right?
Haven't read it at all. Wasn't really too interested in going back and either rereading this issue or moving ahead. But you said something that kind of changed my. You mentioned like this being post Watchmen, and now I kind of want to reread it because now once you mentioned that, I was like, I would like to reread this with like how influential was that over comics that come shortly thereafter? Because I definitely got more of a noir vibe. I mean, I know it's Flash and he's not noirish, but. You mentioned like the VO when he's running across the country. It was a little bit darker. Like it was kind of like, what are you going to do for me? Like, those kinds of moments. I don't know if you get that without Watchmen.
Right. And actually in the second issue of this Flash, there's a direct reference to Watchmen. So if you do read it, you'll notice that. But sorry, Paul, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I don't mean to interrupt. I was going to say for me, by this point of the reboot, DC had become Marvel, and Marvel had become DC.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean by this. Now, DC had like a good, had a pretty consistent quality all across the line, and it's like every title was paid attention to by editorial. Whereas over at Marvel, there was some stuff that was either very good or it was very poor. And I thought, wow, that's just how it used to be. DC used to be like that. Some stuff good, some stuff crap. Whereas Marvel always paid attention to every title. And so that's what it is. When you say about it being a bit more realism, and if you know what Marvel was like in the Bronze Age, I think DC by the mid-80s it became Marvel, which is not a surprise because I know Mike Baron didn't write for Marvel, but you had those other people, Len Wein and Roy Thomas and Marv Wolfman and Gene Colan and George Perez. So, I mean, I don't think it's surprising, really.
You guys could tell me, because I didn't grow up reading DC. It's something I got in later. Do you guys think that has something to do with, again, I don't know if DC was doing this, but I remember in the 80s, obviously, that's when Marvel, like, Spider-Man had like 5 books, and it's just one character. Like, you shouldn't have 5 different titles. Like, how much could you really have going on? The X-Men, you had splintering off into New Mutants and X-Factor, and was DC doing that too at the time? Or were they more self-contained of, no, the Flash, there's not the Invincible Flash and the Barry Allen, Invincible Flash, there's Flash books.
Well, there was, I think the only characters with multiple titles were Superman and Batman.
Yeah.
Which, again, at this point, Batman only had 2 titles, Batman and Detective. And then they slowly started to write Legends of the Dark Knight, then Shadow of the Batman, and then it kind of went from there, unfortunately. But it was, I think 2 is a good number. 3 is maximum. You can't go more than 3, right? But anyway, the other funny thing, I think, is when I do have friends that grew up in the 80s reading Marvel, and they kind of have this impression of Marvel that's stuck in the 80s and said, like, Marvel rules and DC sucks. Well, as you pointed out, Paul, it was a lot of the same, like the exact same creators. Every one of them that had worked for Marvel had already moved over to DC, like Marv Wolfman, Len Wein, George Perez, John Byrne, Steve Englehart, right? There was almost nobody that was exclusive to either company at this point. They were kind of back and forth. So the lines were blurred, but as you pointed out, after a certain point, probably when Jim Shooter left Marvel in '86, Marvel started to get a lot more chaotic and inconsistent with their quality, and DC became more consistent with their quality, I think.
I would. Here's where we can finally disagree.
Okay. Sorry.
No, Marvel.
Yeah, that's fine.
The longer Jim Shooter went on, the more inconsistent Marvel became. He was notable for a lot of good stuff, like notably the writer-artists, John Byrne on Fantastic Four, Frank Miller on Daredevil, Walt Simonson on Thor. The writer-artists really stood out. And, we had some exceptional stuff. I guess we should thank him for that. Thank you, for these things that I still remember so fondly. But then we had other stuff like US 1 or whatever, Team America.
Yes, right.
He had
Human Fly.
Well, that came, I don't know whether it was him, maybe him. But I know he was under this pressure to broaden appeal and everything. And he can't be blamed or faulted for that, trying to broaden the appeal. Mm-hmm. But there were Marvel titles that I would burst to get every issue on. There are other ones I wouldn't touch with a barge pole. Whereas at DC now, Wonder Woman, yeah, I'll get that. Flash, yeah, I'll get that. Batman, I'll get that. Superman, I'll get that. And Justice League, sure, I'll look at that or get that. George Perez is drawing it. It just became much more consistent. But the longer the Jim Shooter reign went on, even though he thinks that Marvel lost nothing, the loss of certain people, apart from George Perez, I think they did. And that's why, for me, Marvel just started becoming DC. It just hit on this all the time. And DC was the company now that was turning out consistently good stuff across the line. So I'm not sure. I wouldn't say it became more inconsistent after Jim Shooter left. It became more inconsistent the longer the Jim Shooter reign went on. And in contrast, with DC under Dick Giordano became better and better and better. Nothing perfect, but still much better. Even one example, and I'll butt out after this, even with Night Force by Marv Wolfman and Gene Colan, I loved it. Dick Giordano said that he didn't particularly like it, wasn't a fan of it for whatever reason, but he still went ahead and said, okay, do it. And I thought it was really good. That series, when I actually worked in Hollywood briefly in the 80s, and I was at a particular film company, and I put forward a synopsis for Night Force, and the big boss, who used to be boss of 20th Century Fox, liked it and arranged for me to go speak to a production executive and so on and so on. Because Night Force has great elements that can be used for a TV show or for a movie. And so Night Force failed in sales, made it to like 13 issues or something. But for me, Night Force was far better than many Marvel titles, around that period. So, no, for me, more and more inconsistent under Jim Shooter at Marvel, more and more consistently good under Dick Giordano at DC.
Well, I'm only going to say one quick thing, and that's that I do, like I said, I was a fan of Jim Shooter's early work on Legion of Superheroes and Superman, and I think he probably was good when he started at Marvel in like the mid-'70s, but as you said, as time went by, I think he became... he got this kind of confirmation bias where he started to think that every thought or decision that he had was the right one, and that as we saw over the years, he drove so many people away from Marvel, and then... to me, it was almost like he exposed himself when he wrote Secret Wars and Secret Wars 2, because those were both terrible. And so I think...
But he made a ton of money for Marvel, though, right?
Right, and that also reaffirmed his belief that what he thought was right, though, right? And so how can you argue with a guy who... Secret Wars at the time was the best-selling comic since the 60s, I think. So he had that inflating his ego, so it was hard to argue with him. So I think that's partly what happened, is he just got too set in his own ways and believing that every decision he made was the right one. So, but who knows? But anyway, so I'm going to say I'm going to try and go on and read more of these Wally West Flashes. And if you haven't read them, Brad, like I know you haven't, the Wally West Flash is brilliant. So I'm not sure when he started. Was it around number 70, Paul? Something like that, 75?
You mean Mark Waid?
Mark Waid, yeah.
62, I think.
Oh, there you go. Okay. So yeah, if these early issues get tedious, Brad, just jump ahead to the Mark Waid one because they're great.
I mean, I know Mark Waid's work is fantastic. So like that's something I have no doubt like getting it. Yeah, it's like one of those, when someone tells you a TV show, it starts out slow. You got to give it some time. I'm like, how long are we talking? Like, sometimes
5 seasons.
2 episodes. I'm like, I could do that. And they're like, season 3 really picks up. I'm like, I don't know if I could stick around for 2 seasons. So yeah, worst case scenario, if I could jump ahead to Mark Waid, that's all good.
Excellent. Okay. So
good.
What were you gonna say, Paul?
I think, Brad, you should give the Mike Baron stuff a shot.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I definitely will. I mean, I did like this issue. It just wasn't something I was like, oh, I gotta go on. Like the introduction to like Randall Savage, like that was cool. Like I really I like that they were setting up something bigger in this story. It wasn't like just a one and done. I mean, and that speaks to the time of the comic. Obviously, like Golden Age and Silver Age, they weren't doing these like long continuity type things. So I kind of like that it set up something bigger. So I was definitely interested right from one issue.
There you go. So here's the thing. This has been a great conversation. I'd love to have you guys on again if you're interested in appearing on Slam, where we compare and contrast the various versions of each DC superhero identity. So yeah, we'd love to have you guys both on again if you're interested. I want to thank you both for joining us. This has been a great conversation, and there's definitely more to talk about with The Flash, more to talk about with DC and Marvel and Jim Shooter and Watchmen and everything else we've talked about. So be sure to join us for all future episodes of Slam, and on our other podcast, Taped Crusaders, our next episode, we're going to be talking about the Incredible Hulk TV show. So be sure to join us for that. And until the next episode, see you later.